Okay, so reading for the day. It's going to be a little, I really want to share the introduction for this. I just think it's just so uber amazing. It's Alan Watts' Nature, Man and Woman. It's a little long, so I might do. This is the introduction to the book. A floor of many-colored pebbles lies beneath clear water, with fish at first noticed only by their shadows. This is by Alan Watts. Hanging motionless or flashing through the liquid, ever-changing net of sunlight. We can watch it for hours, taken clear out of time in our own urgent history. This was just talking about watching fish hanging motionless or flashing through the liquid, ever-changing net of sunlight. We can watch it for hours, taken clear out of time and our own urgent history, by a scene which has been going on just like this for perhaps 2 million years. At times it catches us right below the heart with an ache of nostalgia and delight compounded, when it seems that this is, after all, the world of sane, enduring reality from which we are somehow in exile. That vibrational difference between an animal emanating positive energy and me not would make me feel in exile to a certain extent. But the feeling does not last because we know better. We know that the fish swim in constant fear of their lives, that they hang motionless so as not to be seen, and dart into motion because they are just nerves, startled into a jump by the tiniest ghost of an alarm. We know that the love of nature is a sentimental fascination with surfaces, that the gulls do not float in the sky for delight, but in watchful hunger for fish. But the golden bees do not dream in the lilies, but call as routinely for honey as collection agents for rent. And that the squirrels romping, as it seems, freely and joyously through the branches are just frustrated little balls of appetite and fear. Jesus. Oddly tight cap. Forgive me. We know that the peaceful rationality, the relaxed culture, and the easy normality of civilized human life are a crust of habit repressing emotions too violent or poignant for most of us to stand. The first resting place which life has found in its arduous climb from the primordial natural world of relentless struggle and terror. But we think we know. For this robustly realistic, tough guy picture is as much a recreation of the natural world in our own image as the most romantic and escapist of country escapades. Our view of nature is largely a matter of changing intellectual and literary fashions, for it has become a world strangely alien to us. This estrangement is intensified in a time and a culture wherein it is widely believed that we must depart from the principles which have hitherto governed the evolution of life. For it is felt that the future organization of the world can no longer be left to the complex and subtle processes of natural balance from which life and man himself arose. When the process brought forth human intelligence, it introduced an entirely new principle of order. From now on, it is claimed, the organization of life cannot happen. It must be controlled, however intricate the task. In this task, the human intellect will no longer be able to rely upon the innate and natural wisdom of the organism which produced it. It will have to stand alone, relying strictly upon its own resources. Whether he likes it or not, man, or rather the conscious intelligence of man, must henceforth rule the world. This is an astonishing jump to conclusions for a being who knows so little about himself, and who will even admit that such sciences of the intelligence as psychology and neurology are not beyond the stage of preliminary dabbling. For if we do not know even how to manage to be conscious and intelligent, it is most rash to assume that we know what the role of conscious intelligence will be, and still more that it is competent to order the world. It is this very ignorance of, and indeed estrangement from ourselves, which explains our feelings of isolation from nature. We are, as it were, cut asunder into a confined center of attentiveness, which is I, and a vast organic complexity, which we know only in terms of indescribable and disquieting feelings, or abstract biological technicalities, and this is myself. Abstract biological technicalities. That's really funny. So which is I, a vast organic complexity, which we know only in terms of indescribable and disquieting feelings. So we consider ourselves sort of a conglomeration of just uncomfortable feelings. and abstract biological technicalities. So I have blood and veins, and like, this is how we view ourselves. This is pretty brilliant. Throughout his history, the type of man molded by the Western cultures has been peculiarly estranged from himself, and thus from the natural environment in which his organism inheres. Christian philosophy, which knows so much about the nature of God, has so little to say about the nature of man. For besides its precise and voluminous definitions of the Holy Trinity, stand the vaguest and briefest descriptions of the human soul and spirit. The body, grudgingly admitted to be good because it is God's handiwork, has in practice been viewed as territory captured by the devil, and the study of human nature has been mostly the study of its foibles. In this respect, the psychologists have faithfully followed the theologians. It's brilliant. Never thought about it that way. But now I'm realizing that's because we dice it up into little bits, right? I study my spirituality and I study my psychology, and I don't see how the two are using the same type of theory to analyze the material. For the scientist, despite his theoretical naturalism, tends to regard nature, human and otherwise, as a world to be conquered and reordered, to be made subject to the technology of the rational intellect, which has somehow disowned and shaken off its roots in the very organism it now presumes to improve. In practice, the technical rational consciousness is as alien to the natural man as was the supernatural soul. For both alike, nature and the natural man is an object, studied always by a technique which makes it external and therefore different from the subjective observer. For when no knowledge is held to be respectable, which is not objective knowledge, what we know will always seem to not be ourselves, not the subject. Thus we have the feeling of knowing things only from the outside, never within, of being confronted eternally with a world of impenetrable surfaces within surfaces within surfaces. No wonder, then, that our ideas of what nature is like on the inside are guesses at the mercy of fashion. And he's getting at something huge here that's in the Course in Miracles and other spiritual studies, which is the nature of separation and how we've separated ourselves from everything. And that is identified as the root of suffering in many other thought processes. In some ways, however, the temper of scientific thought is far less managing and imperious than it was at the beginning of this century, if only because greater knowledge brings with it an awareness of ignorance. At the same time, even from the most coldly intellectual point of view, it becomes clearer and clearer that we do not live in a divided world. We don't live in a separated world. The harsh divisions of spirit and nature, mind and body, subject and object, controller and controlled, are seen more and more to be awkward conventions of language. These are misleading and clumsy terms for describing a world in which all events seem to be mutually interdependent, an immense complexity of subtly balanced relationships which, like an endless knot, has no loose end from which it can be untangled and put in supposed order. Think about this even in the political realm of the US, for example, where we think other people are doing things we don't like, and that's making us do things we don't like. We view it all as separate. We don't realize that it's all happening together, that the extremes of different thought processes, the negative news, the lack of faith in politicians, all of that is a simultaneous event that's going together. It's mutually interdependent. It couldn't be happening without all the other parts. If we got that, we could stop all of that a lot faster by realizing how we're engaging with it and what we could do that would create a different set of events that are mutually interdependent. It is not that spirit has been reduced to nature, or to what nature used to mean, or that the mind has been reduced to the body. We have less and less use for words which denote stuffs, entities, and substances, for mind and matter have together disappeared into process. Things have become events, and we think of them in terms of pattern, configuration, or structure, no longer finding any meaning in the question of what stuff is this pattern made. But the important point is that a world of interdependent relationships, where things are intelligible only in terms of each other, is a seamless unity. In such a world, it is impossible to consider man apart from nature as an exiled spirit which controls this world by having its roots in another. Man is himself a loop in the endless knot, and as he pulls in one direction, he finds that he is pulled from another and cannot find the origin of the impulse. For the mold of his thoughts prevents him. He has an idea of himself, the subject, and of nature, the object. If he cannot find the source of the impulse in either, he is confused. He cannot settle for voluntarism, and he cannot settle for determinism. But the confusion lies in the tangle of his thoughts rather than convulsions of the knot. Yet in the present atmosphere of Western thought, the realization of man's total involvement with nature is perhaps depressing. It is humiliating for a culture which always used to think of man as nature's head and lord. Even now, despite ever louder voices of warning, the culture still revels in technical power. Contrary to its avowed philosophy of living for the future, its perspective is really no longer than the day after tomorrow, for it exploits the resources of the earth and the energies of radioactivity with only the most fragmentary knowledge of the complex relationships so disturbed. The apparently depressing thing is not merely that the universe is not to be pushed heedlessly around, but that the very state of mind in which we attempt to do so is an illusion. For if man is one with nature in a seamless unity, his beneficent ideals must after all be rationalizations of the great primordial forces of lust and terror, of blind striving for survival, which we believe to be the basic impulses of nature. But before we decide to be depressed, we could learn to know nature from the inside. The discovery of our total involvement is momentous, so that the understanding of the character and inner working of the endless knot is the most important of all philosophical inquiries. As already suggested, we might find out that our notions of blind primordial urges are pure mythology. Might it not be that they are fashions in anthropomorphic thinking which have simply swung to the opposite pole from the older notion that the primordial impulse was the will of a personal and beneficent God? The very idea of impulsive forces, motivations, and urges may be nothing more than abstract intellectual ghosts, as impalpable as the mysterious it in the sentence, "It is raining." I never thought of that as like a linguistic ghost. I read that in another one of his books where he talks about language. Like, what does it mean, it is raining? Who is raining? What is raining? We don't know. It's just a ghost. It is raining. The same grammatic convention which requires subjects for verbs may be the sole reason for urges and drives behind actions. Yet such a line of thought may be even more disturbing, since it suggests a universe of life which has no motive at all, not even survival. And surely an absolutely purposeless world would be the most depressing of all possibilities. But the idea of a purposeless world is horrifying because it is incomplete. Purpose is a preeminently human attribute. To say that the world has no purpose is to say that it is not human, or as the Tao Te Ching puts it, heaven and earth are not human-hearted. But it continues, the sage is not human-hearted. For what is not human appears to be inhuman only when man sets himself over against nature. For then the inhumanity of nature seems to deny man, and its purposelessness to deny his purposes. But to say that nature is not human and has no purpose is not to say what it has instead. The human body as a whole is not a hand, but it does not for this reason deny the hand. It is obviously the purest anthropomorphism to assume that the absence of a human quality in bird, cloud, or star is the presence of a total blank, or to assume that what is not conscious is merely unconscious. Nature is not necessarily arranged in accordance with the system of mutually exclusive alternatives which characterize our language and logic. Furthermore, may it not be that when we speak of nature as blind and of matter energy as unintelligent, we are simply projecting upon them the blankness which we feel when we try to know our own consciousness as an object, when we try to see our own eyes or taste our own tongues. There is much to suggest that when human beings acquired the powers of conscious attention and rational thought, they became so fascinated with these new tools that they forgot all else, like chickens hypnotized with their beaks to a chalk line. It's a big one. I'm going to reread that. There is much to suggest that when human beings acquired the powers of conscious attention and rational thought, they became so fascinated with these new tools that they forgot